You're listening to Out of the Box podcast with Rosie Tran. Out of the Box is sponsored by hugmetees.com. Spread love, give a hug, hugmetees.com. Guys, we are now on SoundCloud. Check us out on soundcloud.com, Out of the Box podcast, and look for us on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. And as always, we love positive comments. I got a couple new positive emails trickling in this week, and I really appreciate them. But what I would love even more is if you could take that positive information and leave it as a comment on iTunes. That helps our numbers, and it also helps to push us up on the iTunes suggested list of podcasts. So that makes me very happy. So in lieu of an email, I would absolutely love a comment on iTunes. So I'm excited today to have Lisa Betts-LaCroix. She's a advocate for alternative education and creates content for uncollege.org. How are you, Lisa?
I'm good, thanks. Good to be here. Thank you.
I hope I didn't mess up your name too badly.
It's okay.
My French is not. It's a French last name, right?
Yeah, I actually grew up in English-speaking Canada, pronouncing it LaCroix, and then decided that just wasn't going to cut it anymore. So I actually pronounce it correctly. Now it's LaCroix, and the Betts part.
So I
LaCroix.
All right.
Yeah, it's okay.
I had it in my mind, but then I was like, okay, French 101, Rosie, focus.
No
so how did you homeschool your kids? Is that correct?
I do. I don't like the word homeschool. I use it.
Educate me.
No, it's totally fine. I mean, I actually do say homeschool because that's what people understand. It's too long of an explanation to say otherwise. But since you're looking to go deeper than the just general, superficial, top level expectation, I don't like the moniker of homeschooling because I think it gives the wrong impression.
So there's this stereotype, right, that a lot of people that homeschool are like religious nuts, or they're in, I know what you're talking about. I've heard a lot of negative connotations with homeschooling, and you're saying that's not what I'm doing. You're more offering your kids an education system that aligns with your values. Is that more correct?
Yes, that is correct. And it's not necessarily that homeschooling is perceived as negative necessarily, but I think that it's a misnomer. It's a bit inaccurate and it gives the wrong impression. So one thing that I like to say is that many people I know who independently educate their kids don't stay home a lot, and they're not necessarily recreating school. So to call it homeschool gives the idea that, yes, maybe that it's a religious community, and it's not necessarily, but also that people who do it are sitting at the kitchen table with a math textbook and working on math for 45 minutes and then closing it and now saying, okay, it's time to go to the English textbook. And the community that I am most connected with, and the group that I formed in the Bay Area, for the most part, I would say does not do that. Some people do. There's a wide range, and people who do that we call sort of doing school at home. But I like independent education because it implies what's more accurate, at least in the Bay Area, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and in the people that I know, where we're creating very specific, unique, customized approaches to learning for our kids. Mm-hmm. And that could reflect a wide range of values in terms of families' approaches, interest, inclination, learning style, level. So I prefer the word independent education. I know other people who say they do learning a la carte or education a la carte or school a la carte, or they do eclectic learning, or, lots of people use different things. And we all use the word homeschooling, and a lot of people seem to lean towards unschooling these days, although I'd say that's a fairly specific approach too.
So what is the specific approach of unschooling? What does that mean for those of us who grew up in the traditional or conventional system and are interested in this, system that you're talking about, that you guys are creating for yourself and your children? What does that mean to us, use layman's terms for us
okay.
Uninformed?
So I don't consider my family to be an unschooling family. Mm-hmm. For me, unschooling is a fairly wide continuum of approaches to learning that I would say, fairly explicitly reject the standard notions of school. And in its most extreme form, people who call themselves radical unschoolers um, believe in really allowing the learner to completely have freedom and agency over what they do. And in the community of people who call themselves radical unschoolers, sometimes that can even be as extreme as you can sit in front of the television all day long or eat chocolate all day long until you're ready to do something else. Not because they believe it's okay necessarily, or in some cases, actually, they do. It's okay to play video games. There's something to be learned in playing video games all day. Other people who are radical unschoolers believe that if you give a child the freedom to spend their time the way that they wish, that they will come to their own their own understanding of what they're interested, that they're not going to sit in front of the television or play video games all day long, or that if they do, they will be learning something from it. But often what happens is a new interest comes about or arises because that's the way that human beings are. And as a result, when they do come to their interest, it will be completely driven from within. And so they'll have an extreme, what I like to call, and what other people use, an inner locus of control. Will be completely self-directed and motivated rather than somebody else's idea for them. So that's the extreme of radical unschooling. And then there are other people who call themselves unschoolers who are not as extreme, who may just see learning as being following the learner's lead, the child's lead. So if a child becomes interested in things, you see that in ways to engage in that conversation, to provide resources, to strew books around that are related to that topic, so that you follow the child. I've always said that what I do, I don't consider myself to be an unschooler because I have more. I've taken an approach of having more direction and what I call scaffolding with my kids. So I call what I've done in the past 6 or 7 years parent-led, child-approved, which means that I do the research, I come up with the ideas, I make the suggestions, I put, the ingredients, the learning ingredients on the table, and they say, yes, I'm interested in that, and then we'll go deeper into that, or they'll say, no, that's not my thing. The other thing that I also wanted to elaborate on about the difference between what people's perception is of homeschooling and what I call independent education is, this is not true for all people who independently educate their kids, but it's true for some, and it's certainly true for me. I actually don't teach my kids anything. So the idea that I'm sitting at the kitchen table teaching my son calculus, and it's just not going to happen. So I'm more of an administrator, resource, researcher, that sort of helping create the vision for the learning. Anyway, that's a brief aside, a brief throwback to what we were talking about before. But I do think it's important for people to realize, if they're trying to get a picture of what people who independently educate their kids do, to understand that that is not necessarily the assumption that the parent is doing the teaching. And in fact, that's one of the things that so many people will be the first thing to say, oh, I could never homeschool my kids because I'm a terrible teacher, or because my kid and I would just kill each other if I tried to teach them.
So what is the process? So are you having different tutors come in? Are you providing a curriculum? I also want to ask a little bit of logistical information, which just because I know from the people that I know who are independently educating, they were following some type of curriculum so that their kid could get certified, kind of like a GED, obviously, but for elementary level, where they were able to get certain credits. So what is the logistical aspects of that, just for my personal understanding?
Sure. So again, I would say that in the community that I am a part of, a friend and I started a group that supports specifically people who live in the Bay Area who are educating their kids without brick and mortar school, for the purpose of getting them the academic and intellectual challenge that those kids needed and weren't necessarily getting in schools. Mm-hmm. And we have 500 families in it. And I would say it's a fairly unique community, just because the people who come to it are coming to it for those very specific reasons, and because they live in the Bay Area. I would say it's what you're describing, we would call doing school at home. That's where you get a curriculum and you follow the curriculum. You basically are trying to track school.
So how are kids getting? So for example, there's a kid, they're getting independently educated. Maybe they're focusing on their passions or other things that they like. How would they then, say they finish all the way through, they're 18 years old? How would they go on and apply to a college or apply to and say, hey, I have this education?
Well, I mean, I can't speak to the college admission process, and I can't tell you one story that would fit everyone's experience,
Mm-hmm.
but I can tell you in general, broad brushstrokes, that colleges at this point in time tend to really like homeschoolers
Mm-hmm.
because what they have noticed is, and what they recognize to be true, is that they often do have much more of an independent, self-directed approach to learning. And they've often had rich experiences outside of the standard sort of
Traditional
high
school system.
school,
Yeah.
traditional school approach. And they're often very articulate, and they're often very capable of interacting with all levels of people, and very often very mature. So,
Because they're kind of dealing with the real world a bit more than just going to class, which is very not similar to the real world.
exactly. And they've also been encouraged to find what they're most interested in and to go deeply into it. So there's a somewhat mistaken, in my opinion, notion that if a child doesn't go through the standard system as it's designed, that they're not going to have all the things they need to be a learner. And I would say that, while I can't, again, speak to everyone's experience, that anecdotally, it looks to me from my experience and my exposure that kids who have the freedom and the support to really go in depth with their learning become skilled learners. And when you're a skilled learner, even if you missed how to do long division and then you discover you need long division to do the camp
They'll figure it
that's
out.
of interest to you, then you will learn how to do it pretty
Yeah.
easily. The point is that you become an effective learner. And to me, that's the vision that I hold for my kids, and really for everyone, is how do we go into the future of the 21st century as effective, self-empowered, self-directed human beings capable of learning whatever it is that's of interest or of need for our goals, for ourselves and for our lives and for the world. And I think that independent learning often supports that in many great ways. So the answer to your logistical question is it varies state by state.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know the specific rules of very many states outside of California. I can tell you that in California, there's no official way to homeschool. You have two ways. If you decide you don't want to do brick and mortar school, there's two options for you at this point in time. One is to register a private school affidavit, which used to be called an R4. It's a very, very simple form that designates you as the person running a private school. And that private school can have 1 student, 2 students, 4 students, whatever you like. And if you designate yourself as a private school, you can do whatever you want, just like all the other private schools in California. You don't have to do state testing. You really are completely free to do what you like. The other option is to register your student with a public school charter school that supports homeschoolers.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a number of them in all different counties in California, and you are officially a public school student because you're registered with a public school charter, but effectively the parent is the one who sort of designs and supports and sometimes teaches the child. And then the child and the parent meet with an education supervisor from state once a month. In that case, because you're effectively a public school student, you have to do state testing, which used to be called STAR testing. Now it has a new name. You have to follow certain expectations of the bare minimum of what's required in public school. And again, what I see is that the bare minimum of what's required in public school is much lower than what most of the independent learners I know do. So it's really not a problem to sort of show those requirements and then carry on and do the actual learning. Because that's the case, a lot of people will say, well, how many people are independently educating their kids in in California or in the US. And I would say because there's no official way to homeschool, it's very, very difficult to know. Because, like I said, logistically, most of the kids who are independently educated are either designated as students in a small private school or part of a public charter. So I think I answered part of your question. I'm
You
not sure.
did. You answered
Okay.
totally my question and more.
And then the other thing I'd add to your question is the issue of tracking and getting what's needed as a learner in the elementary or K-12 system. One thing that I notice is that people will say, oh, well, how are you going to get your educational needs met? How are you going to make sure your kid has what they need? And like I said, I already addressed that one issue of the question of trying to encourage learners. But the other piece is that there's a wide range of approaches, and not everyone will approach it the same way, but it's definitely possible to create any kind of similar system to the similar school environment or learning or content, or to go completely far away from it. And that most of the people who do homeschool their kids or take their kids out of school are not the kind of people. This is the comment that's often said, well, how does our culture protect for people pulling their kids out of school and then just ignoring them? Well, one thing that I can tell you for certain is most people who pull their kids out of school to independently educate them are not the type of people who would be ignoring and neglecting their kids. It's a lot easier to leave your kid in school in some ways than it is to pull them out and design something for them.
I actually have heard that as well. And I'm sure that there are some cases of that happening, but as you're saying, the majority is not the case.
That's generally not the yes, exactly.
The type of person or the type of personality that's going to pull their kids out of school. I want to talk about this because this is, now with the internet, we hear a lot of, self-help gurus and personal development people and pretty big people in that world saying, hey, traditional school doesn't work. If anything, the people that were failures in traditional school turned out to be, and they always cite, the founders of Apple as dropping out of Harvard and all these big tech giants and all these people, a lot of them being college dropouts or high school dropouts and just going on their own. Do you think the traditional system is failing? I mean, obviously you have your kids in a different situation, but that seems to be the future seems to be heading towards not going to traditional school.
Yeah, I mean, I guess failing is a fairly strong word. I do believe that the traditional brick and mortar institutionalized education system is not keeping up with the times, is not adapting quickly enough to what needs to happen and to what is needed for our future world.
I mean, there's I've heard jokes constantly from parents that they're just basically mini prisons. That's what I've heard constantly from my friends that have kids that is basically, oh, look, another new prison is being built. And they're talking about the middle school down the corner that has, no windows and actually looks like a prison.
Well, I mean, the history and the origin of institutionalized education came out of sort of the Industrial Revolution, where people really needed to have their kids somewhere, and people, and on the more positive side, there's the belief and the possible truth that as a community, hopefully we can band together to give everyone the best of what's possible in learning. And for some people that is so I wouldn't want to go out and full on trash schools, because I've heard stories of people who say, my home life was so terrible and there was such poverty and such dysfunction in my family that going to school was my saving grace. Mm-hmm. And thank goodness I met the teachers that I met there who supported my learning and gave me the idea that something else was possible. Yeah, there's a large group of people who are outside sort of the standard norm, and actually I would say it's almost the majority who are outside of the mainstream in some way or another.
That's why I was making the point that I think it's a fail, because every single person I know, literally every single person I know that I've met, that I've talked to about, so that's 100%, and I know quite a large amount of people absolutely hated school, were bored
Mhm.
growing up, were not
Yep.
challenged, felt
Yep.
stifled, felt like they were being many times brainwashed. A lot of
Yep.
people talk about the traditional school system being a system of institutional brainwashing. You know, having to raise your hand to use the restroom, having to
Yep.
raise your hand to ask permission. It's been, from my experience in the people that I talked to, they felt really like their creativity, their childhood, and they were being molded to fit into a square hole at any
Yes.
cost possible.
Yes. Okay. So that definitely was primarily my experience in school, and it's definitely very common for people to experience that. And I do think that, if we're going to look at what is failing in schools, it is that trying to put people into one particular peg, trying to make everyone the same. The direction it's going is further and further towards that when you look at No Child Left Behind and standardized testing and the Common Core. I mean,
And even teachers that I
it's
talk to
not,
who feel like they can't teach. They feel like they cannot teach
yes,
because they're so focused on brainwashing these kids into getting the certain score on the certain test so the school gets the funding, because they're
yeah.
not going to get funding unless they have a certain amount of kids meeting these certain requirements. And so if you're a kid that's a challenged learner, you're being left behind. If you're a kid that's, more intelligent or needs more challenging, then you're bored out of your mind.
Yeah.
And they're teaching, I have a very good friend who's a public school teacher, and she says she feels as if her hands are tied behind her back and she's just
Yeah.
infuriated and frustrated.
The problem is that in my opinion, teachers who are the most effective, exciting, inspiring educators are the ones who cannot do what they would do best. And so they must be so frustrated being in schools, because that's just not, the mentality is not going towards inspiration and effectiveness and, self-direction. It's really going towards everybody being the same and bare basic minimum. And so, yeah, it's quite sad what's happening in our educational world, in my opinion. Yeah, sure, I agree with the idea that education and the system as it is not very effective and not very good, but we're all needed to make it better. And if you leave the system, you're abandoning sort of the larger culture and, everybody else. So you're
Have
not.
you been accused of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever specifically come out and say, "Hey, Lisa, you are doing this," but that's definitely a common belief system, which is, it's the people, the teachers, and the parents who are really involved and engaged and have really big visions for what's possible that are needed in the public school system. And I know many people who are in the homeschooling world who had long conversations with themselves about leaving the public school because they felt that they could have contributed in some way. Um, I feel personally that it's very, very difficult to change things from within inside the system. And I'm a little bit more of a person who says, hey, mine and other people's biggest contribution can be from stepping outside, making things better, creating more challenge, and for the purpose of everyone rising up together. I also fully, fully support, acknowledge, honor those people who are willing to kind of stay in the system and battle it out. And there are some amazing teachers, amazing people who are doing that. And I give them, total props and major kudos. They're willing to do that. I just believe that we're all needed. And if a teacher or a family feels that their hands have just been too tied from within the system and that they need to go outside of the system and create something else, that in the end benefits the institutional education too, because it creates the possibility. It creates a sense of what else could be going on, and it also sets a requirement for the institutions to kind of rise up and really, really, become better. So.
I like the concepts that you talked about, about a lot of kids who are independently educated being, more mature, having kind of being more well-rounded, because I think that's more in line with what society is. I know a lot of people were promised this idea of do well in school, be successful in life. And as they grow up, they're noticing that that's not always the case, that if you were the straight A student in traditional school, that you're going to be, successful in your lifetime. And I know a lot of adults who are now going back and saying, hey, I feel kind of cheated because that's not really what life is about. And the system that you're talking about, that you're creating, and the community you're creating, sounds a little bit more aligned in what kids have to face in reality.
Yeah, I think that is true. I do think that the idea that we spend, you know, 12, 13 years in a situation where all of the people are around us because of the same age, that we all share the same age. We're all within 11 or 12 months of each other in age, and that's the primary thing that connects us. I think it's a bit odd, a bit manufactured.
Because in
It
real life, you're
certainly
dealing with
doesn't.
people of all ages, all sizes, all ethnicities, all, every single, right? Unless you're living under a shell.
Exactly,
So,
exactly. And the thing is, even if you say, well, we do that because it makes most sense for learning, well, guess what? It really doesn't make sense for learning. There's such a wide variety of people's abilities, and it's not even necessarily, standard for one person. So that makes school situations where everyone's in one class really, really difficult because, one child could be 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 years ahead of the standard English curriculum. That same maybe a year or two behind in math, or a variety of other things, or social skills, or PE, or whatever. So to try to say everyone is the same and at the same level because of the same age, it just doesn't really make any sense. And I do think that what you're alluding to, and what I think I mentioned before, is true, is that if you're outside of the traditional education, our kids are interacting with so many more adults than most kids get exposure to every single day. So many more people in the community. They're out doing things, with all ages of kids. So they get used to, being kind to the younger children, supporting them, helping them. They get used to people being different from them in so many different ways. And I think it not only creates an opportunity for people to find their own course educationally, but it also creates kids who are so much more tolerant of people who are different from them. The kids that I know who are independently educated, they just do not think in terms of cliques, or in terms of, finding a way to survive socially, or, dissing because they're younger or older or different, or, or it's just such a different kind of cultural feel socially, for the kids that aren't in typical schools. Now, I haven't been in a typical school for a really long time, but I do know some kids, and I do pass with some kids who are in school, and many of them are amazing human beings. But I definitely see more of a pattern anecdotally towards a sort of in-group, out-group,
cliques and
uh,
bullying and things like that.
cliques. Yeah, I hear about bullying. I don't know any kids who are personally, but um, there are a lot of people who come to our group who have exceptionally bright kids, and they have said, wow, my kid was so bullied in school, not only by sometimes the kids, but also sometimes by the teachers, because they just didn't know how to handle that. Their sort of out of the boxness wasn't necessarily appreciated or welcomed. So yeah, what
And
else? I feel like I'm
that
kind of.
kind of goes in alignment with what I talked about, because you're saying that kids are at all different levels of development, not just one level for 11-year-olds and 11-year-olds, right? It may be an 11-year-old would be at a 13-year-old's level for one thing and a 10-year-old's level for another thing. But, the only way in the traditional system to elevate that is by skipping a grade. And I remember several kids growing up in my personal experience that were skipped to higher grades because of their intelligence level. And there was a level of jealousy, and they were extremely picked on.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's not uncommon. And what you said just a second ago about the fact that some kids might be a couple of years higher or lower than their grade range, I would say that that's in many ways more common than not if you look at ability. Now, you may be able to
Per
equal
subject
out
or
and just.
per developmental whatever, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And just that fact that if you take a kid's ability and you really give them the ability to go fully at their own speed in any given subject area, my guess is you're going to see all over the map in terms of ability. Sure, there'll be some kids who are given their ability to operate full potential, which schools do not do, in my opinion, or very rarely do for very few people. You will see some people who end up sort of racing ahead in all subjects evenly. But that's going to be very uncommon. What's likely to be more common is you'll see an any given kid racing ahead in particular subjects, maybe, not even not racing as much forward in a different subject. Even that could change over time. A kid who's passionately involved in and, really interested in economics might race ahead and really engage in that and get really deeply involved in it. And at a certain point later, maybe they'll just totally passionate about math and then start to, have that one race ahead. So I think that asynchrony, which is what we call it, is both the asynchrony, meaning you have different abilities at different levels and they're not necessarily matched. You might have, 6 years of difference between your ability in one subject versus another. We call that asynchrony. And I'd say that's more common than not for most people, especially if you let them really operate, which they're.
So what about kids in high school? There's kind of a joke that a lot of parents have made that have kids in high school who ask, their kids come to them and ask them for tutoring or ask them for help. And, this is like a common joke. A lot of parents will say, well, I don't remember any of that stuff. You're never going to need it. So what about at the high school level, kids who just have no interest at all in advanced calculus or advanced sciences and just want to not learn about that? Is that, do you think that's a disservice as a parent that's independently educating to not focus on that because they might have potential in it, or just what happens when a child is just so strong, has such a strong proclivity to one subject or one topic, and you're independently educating them?
Oh my gosh, that's a really hard question to answer because
Did I ask
I don't
something
have
loaded?
No, I just don't have personal experience with it. So I have a 16-year-old and I have a 10-year-old, and I know people who have all different ages of kids, and some families really take the perspective of, let the kids do what they want. And when they want to do something else, they'll learn it. So I'll give you some sort of little anecdotes that I can think of.
Okay.
I have a friend whose son is really passionately interested in musical theater. And about when he was 15 or 16, he was absolutely clear that's what he was going to do. He had not done very much in the way of math because he doesn't like it, and it just wasn't something they prioritized in any kind of extraordinary way. They kept it sort of basically engaged. But now he wants to get into one of the programs for musical theater, one of the colleges. And to go to musical theater, you have to have math. So now and you have to write the SAT. So now he, of his own volition, is taking on becoming a really strong person in math because he has to go to study musical theater. And so that's one way it can happen. A kid gets passionate about something, and then they are willing to jump through the hoops they need to get to that goal. And then they take on what they need.
So it seems like a lot of true passion towards learning, not just, being forced to. I mean, he is being forced to in the fact that he has to do these math courses to get what he wants, but that's part of like everyday life, right? If you want to reach a certain goal in life, you have to sometimes do a couple things that you're not that wild about. But it seems like the passion for the learning is coming from the internal.
Yes, it's a means to an end that's motivated by his desire and his passion for what he loves. That said, again, another thing I would offer is that I don't have sort of really broad universal experience, because I do run the group that I run is attracts people who are looking often for more advanced offerings for their kids than they were getting in school. And I would say there's a pretty large percentage of high ability math kids in our group. So in fact, they end up getting more what they would have needed that they wouldn't get in school in terms of that kind of thing. So I'm trying to project forward with my daughter. My daughter is not likely to be oriented that way. And the way that I approach things with her is I do require stuff of her because I don't want to close any doors. Not even so much in terms of somebody else's acceptance of her, but I don't want to close any doors in terms of her ability to see herself as someone who is interested in good at something like math. So I do play the parent card in some cases, and especially she's 10. But as my son's gotten older, for example, I'm much more likely to really dig into what he's interested in to support what he wants and to be more willing to say, okay, well, we don't need to worry so much about that. I mean, he's a pretty um, general, um, well-rounded person, and he also is pretty willing to take my opinion and to respect my perspective. So if I say to him, I really think it would be good this year to work on your writing output, he'll think about it and he'll say, yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a good idea. Um, Usually there's the reason why is because we have respectful, collaborative kind of relationship. And I think that that's one of the foundations that's really important and possible when you're working with one or two or three kids. You have the time to say, hey, what's going to be right for you? Let's explore it. Whereas if you're trying to manage 20 kids or 25 kids or 30 kids, how could they ever really have very much of a relationship with someone who's really going to say, is this necessary for you? Is this important for you? Is this the right decision for you? If not, how can we find an alternative?
It
You
sounds
know?
like there's a lot of respect and honor and mutual appreciation of each other the actual human being of the child instead of just you're a number in a classroom or need to be quiet and pay attention. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's facilitated by the fact that there is more time for that when you just are working with a smaller group of kids. And it's not just necessarily even me with my own kids. I feel like there's a number of kids in my community who I helped raise because we've been doing this together. We create classes. I've, organized things, and in some cases even taught or run groups. Like, for example, I ran a creative problem solving group with 5 or 6 kids for a number of years. And so, we also develop relationships with each other's kids, but it's still a small enough group where you're actually able to think about the individual person and what they are and who they need. And I think you just hit on something which is really true, which is that allows for an environment and a relationship that's based on respect for the individual that is the learner. And yeah, I think that's really important. And I definitely think that that's the case. That's what I have with my son. Even though he's 16 and he's, in a process where he's figuring out what's right for him. And I think that our relationship is based on respect. And he knows that I put a bunch of time in and a bunch of work in to try to support and encourage him in ways that are right for him. But that it's a conversation. Ultimately, it's a conversation where he has a lot to say in what's right for him. And so was he just born a reasonable person? Yeah, to some degree he was, but I also think that he's more likely to respond like a reasonable, mature, independent thinking, self-directed person because he's been, he's been given an
Treated that
environment,
way.
he's been treated that way and had an opportunity to grow in that way.
But when you ask the question, was he born a reasonable person? I think a lot of children, in fact, most children are born very reasonable, and
Yes.
and many of them are marginalized to the point of misbehaving. I actually just had an amazing child advocate on a child psychology advocate on the show, and he was talking about how he works with children and children are very smart and they're little geniuses, and what happens is that they become marginalized or treated as children, and so they act accordingly. And when children are throwing temper tantrums or having these outbursts, or in your teen years when you're rebelling, it's because you're not feeling heard. And
Yeah.
so are these independent educated kids, as you've seen, that are in the high school age, less rebelling less than maybe the typical teen who doesn't feel heard or feels stifled?
I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I absolutely believe that if kids can grow up feeling respected and like they matter and like they have a choice and that their needs are being met, that they're more likely to respond that way. I mean, I guess the thing that weighs on my mind constantly, and it does a little bit go back to that question of leaving the public school system, is how to make this scalable, and to some degree, I have some sort of broad brush answers in my own head that have to do with community. Um, but but as you're even saying that, part of my brain is going to, yeah, but what about all those other kids who don't have the environment? I still do have that kind of inner conflict for the many, many kids who are in that situation where they don't have I don't know. My heart just breaks a little bit for what you're describing, the
Well,
numbers of kids that are in situations.
by creating the environment that you've created, you're actually encouraging more parents, and by, me spreading the word about it, we're encouraging more parents to look at that, because I do believe that most parents, obviously there are some parents who, you know, um, have children, maybe they feel they didn't have the choice, or they are not the best parents. But I believe that most parents do want the best for their kids, and they think that they're doing what's best for their kids because maybe it's what they had done to them, or the way they were raised. And
Yeah.
so we're just offering an alternative, and don't let it weigh on your mind, because you're actually taking a step forward and leading by example. And maybe someone will listen to this podcast and say, hey, maybe I should look into that for my kids. Because I do believe that, you know, people genuinely want to do a good job. They just, if they're
Yeah.
not doing a good job, it's because they don't know how, or they don't know that there's an alternative.
Yes. I guess the piece that I'm really referring to is that there's a scalability issue. So right now, the people that I know, and me also, many of us, uh, I would say there's a high percentage of mothers in our group as opposed to fathers, although we do have quite a few fathers who are the stay-at-home, independent, uh, learning parent, primary homeschooling parent. And we also have quite a few families who are working parents. And we have a few single parents also. So, but the reality is, it still is easier to do if you have the financial means, if you have another parent who's working, if it still does require, those of us who are the primary parent to have taken some kind of pause on our own careers. Many, many, many of the people in my group, the women, there's many attorneys, there are many really successful professional people who have taken pauses on our careers for some period of time so they can actually give that kind of attention to their learners, to their kids at home who are, to support them. Now, it's not strictly required, and there are a number of places that we all support each other, and where the classes are formed, or communities are built, or there's co-ops. And like I say, it is possible for people to also work and have their kids learning, at home or out in the world. But it's harder, and it's not 100% scalable. And so I guess what I'm referring to is the query in my own mind of how to spread some of the thinking that we're doing and some of the exploring that we're doing, maybe even into schools, or having schools, morph more towards what we're doing. So I guess I'm sort of agreeing with what you're saying, is that by doing it, yes, we're creating alternatives, but we're kind of not at the epitome of success yet. In order to be at the epitome of success, it needs to be more scalable and more community oriented. And I do think if somehow we were able to create learning sort of centers that were mixed age, that were alternated and scaled to the ability and the interests of the learners, that had people coming in from outside world, as mentors, that we have a mentoring kind of culture, that we have a la carte choices in terms of, to learn this and this, but not that for right now. I don't exactly know what the details are, but I think there's some marrying of sort of the traditional collectivity of a school situation with the independence and, individualization and the sort of learner respect and self-directed culture that is possible in the independent learning world.
I think there's a little bit of that going on. I know Montessori school is an alternative to traditional school, and that has a little bit of that. And also, the charter school system is morphing the traditional school system a little bit. And there are some excellent charter schools that are kind of addressing some of these issues. But I think you're right. There's still a long way to go. And definitely the current system is not, I know you said you didn't want to bash it. I definitely think it's failing. I have not met anyone that came out of the traditional school system that felt like it did them their highest potential. Let's just say that.
Yeah. Well, and then just to piggyback on what you're saying, it's true, and there are, especially, I know mostly this, there are a number of new high schools developing with slightly different approaches. There's a couple of pretty progressive elementary age schools, and there's going to be more and more. And I actually I know that there are going to be just last year 3 new high schools started that I know of with alternative approaches. I see them get even more radical in their approach than they're currently doing, especially in the public school realm. There's a lot of alternatives in terms of in the private sector, where people are offering classes, individualized classes for different people. And it's what I call the direct to consumer learning model. So where parents are used to paying for classes, but they don't necessarily want to pay for a whole private school, but they'll pay for this class, that class. So that's really popping up. And I know it's going to increasingly do so. But yes, absolutely change needs to be made. And hey, we haven't even talked about higher ed yet. So
Yes, I wanted to mention that before we unfortunately have to end
yeah.
in a little bit. But I wanted to talk about that because you create content for a website called uncollege.org. And I wanted to get your opinion on whether or not college is really serving people because, we constantly hear, in the mainstream media, oh, there's all these, high levels of unemployment, people with college educations just sinking deeper and deeper into student loan debt. And, then there's institutions that are popping up online that are teaching in the skills that people need to my husband is actually studying at one of these independent institutions right now to get information. He's in the IT industry, and he, instead of going back and paying a 4-year college to get he is an engineer and switched into the IT field, and instead of going back to a 4-year college to get his computer science degree, he's just taking these online courses on different IT classes and programming and other things. And he's been able to, get a job and network and do other things that you would traditionally need to do at a 4-year college. So what, is the higher education system also kind of disappearing or falling behind?
It's absolutely radically changing. And I believe it's going to change even more. In 2008, a professor from one of the universities did a talk on how the institutions need to change or die. And I saw that in 2008 and felt absolutely 100% so on board, so true. And what I've seen is the speed of which people are realizing that it is a crumbling tower has been so much fast. It's happened so much more quickly than I really expected it to. And I mean, we have very little time, but yes, the amount of student debt's unforgivable. It's at $3 trillion right now. People are going to their senior citizen ages with college debt. There's not any certainty that people will be able to get jobs that will pay for their debt. That doesn't even address efficacy. So all of this to say in such a brief amount of time that the university systems have to change. They will change. Peter Thiel says it's a bubble. It absolutely is a bubble. We cannot sustain the amount of cost. It costs $60,000 to go to Stanford now. And you can get student aid if your family makes under 100,000. But if you'd make over 100,000, I think it's very difficult to get very much aid. That's not merit aid. And so, I mean, this is just, it can't go on like that. That, again, it doesn't even address, can we be learning more effectively?
And the answer is yes. These online universities are popping up everywhere, and people are doing that a la carte learning with online institutions.
Yes.
And you're just needing certain certifications or certain, you can take these online courses that satisfy the information that you need to get certain careers now. And especially with the speed of technology and the speed of technology careers that are emerging, to implement this type of learning into an institution would take longer. The information would be outdated.
Yeah, you just hit on one piece that I think is one of the central changes that we're going to see in the university or in the higher ed system going forward, and that is the granularity of learning. So I believe the 4-year degree may not necessarily have the same cachet that it has in the past, but rather people are going to see the possibility of spending the money that they have at their disposal on more, like I say, granular, more smaller pieces. So the chunks are going to become smaller. It's going to be a content offering, or a particular program, or a particular class, or a particular concept that people will be paying to learn, or a particular skill set, rather than this big part and parcel $60,000 4-year no, 60,000, what, $250,000 a 4-year Ivy League degree or something. Um, I think that's one of the huge changes. I also believe that one of the holy grails of the higher ed system that's ripe for disruption is the credentialing system. And that refers to how people perceive um, another person's worth or ability. And it used to be that if you had a degree from Harvard, okay, that was the highest thing you could have in terms of your signal to the world. I think that's going to radically change, and I can't even necessarily predict how it's going to change, other than the learning is going to be granular, the credentialing is going to be more granular, and we're going to have more attention on what people are capable of and what skill sets they already have.
I think the internet and the connectivity and the technology that's out now is really creating a system of competitiveness, not in a negative way, but really, I guess, more creativeness is a better term to use, where people are really just, I mean, there's no excuses now. You know, you really have access. It's kind of leveling the field. Whereas before, you had to have money, to maybe go to a higher institution or go to an Ivy League school, or you had to know someone. A lot of Ivy League schools have a extreme preferential treatment for alumni's children and other things like that. So, it was a little bit of an old boys club. And I think the internet is now leveling that in so many ways, because
Absolutely.
a lot of it is just not relevant anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the reason why I say that the credentialing system is ripe for disruption, because it's really clear to most people that content and skill building is available online, but people still don't understand yet how that will translate to other people's perception of their worth. So I hear a lot of people say, okay, yes, I get that I can learn the content, but I still need the degree to be able to show that I'm valid, or that I'm skilled, or that I'm capable, or that I'm worthy of a high paying job, or whatever it is I'm after. But that's the part that I think is really going to change in some really unexpected ways in the not very distant future.
And I still am not understanding, how the higher education system has been growing in cost. I know that in certain states there's funding cut, and so that makes costs go up. But um, I don't know what is bleeding these universities, because they keep raising costs, and I'm not understanding where it's coming from.
Yeah, I cannot answer to that one. If you watch a movie like Ivory Towers, they'll say that certain administrators are making a lot of money. I don't I don't think teachers are making a whole pile of money, so I'm not really exactly sure where it goes to. But yeah, that's outside of my realm of expertise for sure.
So what would
uh,
you what do you suggest for students who are, freshly 18 and looking for um maybe an alternative to traditional higher ed?
well, I think the most important thing is to think about what is specifically unique to you, what it is that you want to have a mentor or a community of people, to build your network of supporters, to have a mentor, or like I say, other people that you work with or you learn with, to start having the conversation about what is it that you need, just like people do in their adult lives. Sorry, my I'm obviously, people are trying to reach me. Sorry for all the beeping. Um, so I'd say that to have a community of people and a support network is super, super important. And then to really just open your mind up as to what's possible, because really, truly anything is possible. There's so much to be learned from traveling. There's so many programs up there. You mentioned Uncollege. Uncollege has a gap year program that I think is really interesting. There's alternative universities like Watson University in Colorado that are offering like support for kids who really want to make a difference and change the world. There's something called the Millennial Train Project, which gives kids the opportunity to do sort of an on-train learning short. This is a short one, going across the states to learn. There, Blake Bowles has a program for 15 to 18-year-olds that's a 3-month independent learning program for self-directed learners, where they take on challenges every day as a community. There's for 30 kids. That's coming up. I mean, and there are going to be more and more offerings like that are outside of the box. So I say, if you're someone who isn't sure college is right for you, don't just accept it part and parcel as the next thing that everyone does everyone's doing it and have to do it because for whatever XYZ reason you're giving it. There are so many opportunities, and if there isn't the one that you want, you can create it.
And also, you don't have to go into the traditional system as well. You can create your own career there. And even, aside from, we're talking about education, there's even, farms where you can go and learn how to do organic farming and intern as an organic farmer. I mean, there's the internet and the interconnectivity of the world is just shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And there's so many things that you can do that's not just, go to college, get a job. I mean, before, back in the day, we just had the Peace Corps and that's it. But
the other thing I'd say is that if you're someone who's really passionate about going to college and you know why you're going there and you're able to get into a college that's of interest to you and you have enough financial support to be able to do it either through scholarships or through, family support or through your own savings, that you can do it without getting yourself extremely into debt, by all means go if that's what you're into, if that's what's right for you. But if that's not the case, then don't just go not knowing what you're going to do with the idea that, well, of course, it's what I have to do. And that's where I just jump on what I'm saying, which is use the internet, use your resources. Know that there are so many opportunities and so many programs and more every day, and even not programs, just like you can design your own world. The other thing is that if you decide to jump off the treadmill for often, do a gap year or your own self-designed gap year or travel or work or intern, you can always go back to college. My husband went off and did his own thing until he was 25, and then he decided he wanted to go. He thought, oh, now I'm ready to go to college, and then he went to Harvard, MIT, and Caltech when he was 25 or 26. And I think he probably enjoyed it so much more going at that age than he would have when he was 18 or 19. So, opportunities abound. Just, I would say my biggest piece of information of suggestion is just do not accept what's right in front of you. Look more broadly for what's possible and make sure it fits you and who you are.
And I think that makes a lot of sense to take time because, what 18-year-old knows what they're doing? How many, shake your head if you're listening, probably everyone. If you changed majors once or twice your first year in college, a lot of, kids don't know what they're doing and they need a little bit of time to figure stuff out, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
You don't have to go right after high school. The majority of people I know changed majors 2 or 3 times and actually got into a little bit more college debt than they could handle because they were in longer, kind of washing around back and forth. So you don't have to do, as Lisa said, exactly what is there. You can make your own decisions. And if you have parents pressuring you, it's your life. Lisa, where can people find you? What is the name of your program that you're supporting up there in the Bay Area? Where can people get more information?
Well, the program that I've already mentioned really is it's a private homeschool group. I mean, people can contact me. I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. And the program that I mentioned, the Gap Year program, is Uncollege. That's at uncollege.org. Then the other programs I mentioned are also pretty easy to find. Watson, I'm also a sponsoring, suggesting person for Watson. They're a pretty interesting college to look at too. I think they're just search on Watson University. And then, I'm working right now slowly on a book on meta learning, because meta learning is the thing that I believe is necessary for all people going forward. And that is, how do we learn the skills that are needed to be learners going forward in the world, because we're constantly going to be learning. So I'm always interested in hearing from people around the concept of meta learning. If people have projects or things they're working on related to being a meta learner. We didn't really talk about the details of that, but definitely interested in hearing about that. So my website is lisabetl.com. It's actually down right now, but I hope to have it back up pretty soon. And I usually post the things that I'm working on there.
Okay, perfect. So guys, check her out and get some more information on alternative education at uncollege.org. Guys, please go on iTunes, itunes.com/outoftheboxpodcast, and subscribe. Subscribers really help us a lot and push our numbers up and make more people find out about the podcast. And as always, we're on outoftheboxpodcast.com, and you can click on the donate button. We are now accepting Litecoins and Bitcoins and all alternative currency. And on SoundCloud, please visit our sponsor, hugmetees.com. Spread love, give a hug, hugmetees.com. This has been Out of the Box Podcast with Rosie Tran.